In part 1, we covered most of the Evolutionary War, but not all of it. That's because, wow, the Avengers. They complicate things tremendously. We need to take another detour to get into what that means. And in fact, we need to take a detour from the detour first. That is, the other half of the Evolutionary War before we get to that. As I'd said, the character was gone from Marvel for a long time. It seemed clear that if they were making this big of a deal out of him, they should get the readers up to speed on this guy. But more than that, they should fully explore the High Evolutionary's background and his silent place in the Marvel Universe. High Evolutionary was originally an adversary of Thor, and as you'll see, will wind up cropping up in his book a lot now that he's back. And he had Wundagore, a mountain laboratory that was also a rocket, filled with a furry's dream, a whole score of anthros. They were animals that the High Evolutionary had evolved into humanoid forms, his new men. We see how he started out as a brilliant but underappreciated scientist, how he and a friend teamed up to pursue their work and were helped along by the discovery of huge amounts of uranium in the mountain. The friend's wife and little girl Jessica were there with them, except over time, the radiation of the uranium insidiously poisoned her, enough to be a death sentence. But her father had one of his experiments, and the High Evolutionary was able to keep her in a kind of stasis while that worked to try to cure her. But then, as so often happens, tragedy struck, when the mother was killed by a werewolf. Just another day in the life of Marvel Universe. The presence of the werewolf required the High Evolutionary to defend himself, so he created his armor to do just that. He studied the werewolf after capturing it. Turns out that it was a family curse and the nearby Baron wished to cure himself of it. Also showing up to challenge his knowledge of science is the ghost of a monk who was taken over Jessica's father's body to warn about the demon they risk awakening that lives in their mountain. And during a time when the Baron was trying to foolishly use the Darkhold to cure his lycanthropy, the demon was given power and slaughtered a bunch of the High Evolutionary's animal knights. I know that whole thing sounds like a Mad Lib, but that's what happened. The reason for the animal knights, if you're curious, is that the High Evolutionary figured under the circumstances, instilling a code of honor in them would keep them well behaved. At the same time that this conflict was happening, a pregnant woman arrived and gave birth to twins, Wanda and Pietro, the Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. And if you thought that was surprising, just get a load of this. Back in 1976, Filmation had found success by combining their Tarzan cartoon with Batman. I mean, obviously not in the same actual stories. That would probably play itself out pretty fast. They had the idea to go further with original superheroes, one of which was going to be called Spider-Woman. As the owners of Spider-Man, and concerned about having the name denied them, Marvel rushed out a character named Spider-Woman in Marvel Spotlight number 32 and registered the trademark on the name, beating Filmation to the punch and forcing them to rename their character as Web-Woman. Hilariously, she is called Spider-Woman solely on the cover, as inside the book, her name is Arachne. She wouldn't actually have the name Spider-Woman until she returned the following year, in a story by Marv Wolfman taking up 5 issues in, of course, Marvel 2-in-1. I told you, everything gets sorted out there. It's the multi-tool of Marvel. So successful was this that Spider-Woman was given her own solo book, which ran for 50 issues, ending with her seeming death as she heads off into the spirit realm. Roger Stern over on Avengers, we're going to get more into that in a moment, brought her back, with help from Doctor Strange, that'll come up too, although she will now be depowered. She would, after the Evolutionary War, become a supporting character in Wolverine's solo book during the time when he was Patch and lived a secret life in Madripoor. But that didn't last long, as Chris Claremont, who cooked up all the Madripoor stuff, wound up leaving the book. She bopped around in a couple places until in 1996, in Sensational Spider-Man, she got her powers back. Well, by now you've no doubt figured out that the extract that Jessica's father used to save her was drawn from spiders, and when she was cured, it eventually allowed for her spider powers. Now you might be thinking, yeesh, why that absurd retcon tying her to the High Evolutionary? Actually, that tie-in appeared in her original appearance way back in Marvel Spotlight number 32, when the Hydra leader mentioned it. He just assumed that she was like any of the other so-called new men, just that she'd been evolved from a spider instead of, say, a cow. It wasn't long before the she was a spider made into a human was proven false, but the tie to the High Evolutionary remained, as you can see. With this, the story of the High Evolutionary catches up with the history that we see in the comics. His initial involvement with Thor and flying off, bringing the Hulk to his world, and eventually needing to evolve himself to survive the wounds of the revolution among his new men, turning him into a godlike entity. His return to flesh was that it was simply too much for his ultimately human mind to fully handle, instead giving him a body representative of hundreds of thousands of years of improvement. His creation of Counter-Earth, involvement with Warlock until he had dealt with the Man-Beast and left, and the time he fought Galactus. Oh, did you know that the High Evolutionary fought Galactus over Counter-Earth's fate? Yeah, the ball's on him, huh? By the time the story reaches the Avengers annual where the Evolutionary War is concluded, it has caught up with where he was in part 1 of this tie-in. That stuff with Ben Grimm, Sphinxor, and the Beyonders, and goading the Hulk into destroying his armor so he can devolve into organic soup. But the final page finally connects things to the present, as the armor then reverses the process. And the perspective of being to both ends of the evolutionary spectrum has made the High Evolutionary conclude that humanity's evolution must instead be guided by him, to take our species beyond even the Beyonders. That's the motivation behind the Evolutionary War, as a big middle finger to the people who stole his planet and then called it adorable. But what about the Avengers? The cover doesn't show the roster that you're familiar with. Well, see, that's a whole nother situation, so buckle in. You'll recall in 1982, Captain Marvel died, and I said it was to allow for a new character to use the name. You now know, of course, that that person was Monica Rambeau. They wasted no time on that. She was introduced by Roger Stern and appeared during his 5-year run of the Avengers during the 80s. Stern had a vision for a long game with her. It starts with Captain Marvel being passed over for promotion in the Coast Guard. She gets her powers, becomes an Avenger, serves with distinction, and eventually she would become the new chairwoman of the team, to show that the things that held her back in the Coast Guard didn't apply to the Avengers. Well, there was a problem, or rather 2 problems, maybe really 3, it depends on how you want to count them. I mentioned that before being offered the Silver Surfer, Steve Englehart was writing the West Coast Avengers once it actually went to ongoing series. Well, Roger Stern had been writing them when they were miniseries and all of that, and had plans for the pairs of teams to swap characters between them back and forth as needed. It was going to be a more fluid situation with the 2 books. Handing control of one of the books over to someone else left him stuck with what he had. That included the use of an odd character. Remember I said Doctor Strange appearing in Avengers would come up? Well, this is it. Stern felt that a true magic user was missing from the team, so after Doctor Strange had pitched in, another character was brought in to help out, a reformed character named Dr. Druid. Now, I don't mean reformed as in a former villain. I mean that originally he was somebody else. He was Dr. Droom, pre-Fantastic Four days, and essentially had the same origin as Doctor Strange, but there was a few notable differences, such as, well, skin-crawling Asian stereotyping, including Dr. Droom undergoing a race change and becoming Asian and literally turning yellow. Dr. Droom didn't last long, and later on when Steve Ditko had an idea for a mystic named Mr. Strange, Stan grafted on elements of Dr. Droom, and that became Doctor Strange. Dr. Druid came back later on as essentially a more modernized version of himself. The race change stuff was ejected, and his name was altered so it wouldn't be easily confused with a certain armor-clad dictator. Stern added Dr. Druid to the team to provide a mystical angle that the team lacked, and wanted to give him a personality like that of Charles Winchester on MASH, very aloof and proper around these more boorish types. But things were happening behind the scenes at Marvel. Jim Shooter was thrown out and replaced with Tom DeFalco, who had Mark Gruenwald as his number 2. Well, Mark Gruenwald was of a mind that Marvel had allowed itself too much change with its characters, and it seemed that Tom DeFalco agreed. Englehart's change to Fantastic Four was one example of something they didn't like. Marrying Spider-Man off was another. They wanted to give the books the illusion of change while keeping things the same. So one thing Gruenwald wanted to do was to get the Avengers sorted out. And by sorted out, I mean with Captain America back on top where he belongs. After Stern had spent years getting to the point for Captain Marvel to leave the team, now Gruenwald said, "Great, now you need to kick her down so that Captain America could take the spot." It's true that some felt that Stern had gone a little overboard on his pet character, and I'm not saying that's an invalid opinion. But suffice to say, Roger Stern was very protective of what he had worked so hard to achieve. So when Gruenwald told him to discredit Captain Marvel as leader, Roger Stern refused. Gruenwald responded by firing him, and having Ralph Macchio, who had worked with Gruenwald in the past on Marvel 2-in-1, fill in the issues with what he'd wanted, making Captain Marvel look like she was full of self-doubt, and justifiably so, while Dr. Druid, of all people, is seen as effective and hungry to be in charge. Definitely nothing wrong with the optics of setting the black woman up to fail so a bald old white guy can take her job. Walt Simonson was then brought in to provide a 10-issue run that would allow for Steve Rogers to get the top job back. The arc is referred to by the words that appeared in an ad announcing it: "Nothing lasts forever." Over this arc, the team suffers the losses of Namor and his wife, Captain Marvel is hospitalized, and thanks to mental manipulation of the others, Dr. Druid has himself named chairman of the 3 remaining: Black Knight, Thor, and She-Hulk. This is when that issue with that woman who called herself Nebula but isn't actually Nebula, well, the one we know anyway, shows up, manipulating Dr. Druid, who's in turn manipulating all of them. But in the end, Dr. Druid and fake Nebula get thrown into the time vortex. She-Hulk is so shaken by the way her own teammate would manipulate her like that she leaves. And what's worse, a horrified Jarvis learns that Thor has to return to Asgard to deal with a serious problem there, and the Black Knight is coming along to help him. That means that there is no longer an Avengers team. They're all gone. This brings things back around then to the Evolutionary War. As you see, we have an Avengers issue, and there aren't any Avengers. Well, a message comes in at Hydrobase, where the Avengers had their headquarters at the time. But since there are no Avengers to answer the call, the computer calls up the reserves, starting with, and we're throwing more potential confusion in here, the Captain. You might recognize this costumed character as that of U.S. Agent. Well, it's not. This was in a weird period when Captain America was stripped of his title, shield, and uniform, and so had a new costume and shield made, and called himself the Captain. So it's still Steve Rogers, he just doesn't have the same look or name. Other reserves that show up are the Falcon, Hercules, here in defiance of his father Zeus's orders, a lady who stole the Yellow Jacket costume and thus gets hijacked into this, and the Beast, back in his blue fur form thanks to a recent development in X-Factor, and has brought along the Hulk. The Hulk at this time is gray, and had gotten a life for himself, working as an enforcer for a casino owner and gangster in Las Vegas, and so took the name of Joe Fixit. Joe Fixit is the Joe persona we talked about over on Incredible. He's what you'd be left with if you took Bruce Banner and stripped away all of his inhibitions, limitations, his need to be seen as an intellectual. He's not what you would call smart per se, but he is incredibly cunning. In this body, though, he's also the smallest of the Hulks. He's still very impressive. But when it came time for Dr. Doom to want to deal with the Thing and he brought the Hulk in, it was clear this was a bad time for this matchup. Remember what I said about Ben Grimm's situation over in Fantastic Four? He was further mutated by cosmic rays? Well, he's been made stronger than he ever has been thanks to that. In the pages of Fantastic Four 320, Ben Grimm, for once, goes up against the Hulk with the strength advantage. This incarnation that he has now is his strongest, while the Hulk's is, well, the least strong of all his incarnations. Joe learns to his horror that compared to the new Thing, he's puny. It's a humiliation. In Incredible Hulk 350, though, after Doom rescues and dismisses Joe as not being up to the job, Joe argues that strength isn't what matters in a fight. Winning is what matters. So he has a rematch with the Thing, this time using his cunning rather than trying to rely on raw strength, and manages to defeat him. He's pleased but doesn't take Doom up on his offer. Instead, he starts to head for home. But he's in New York, remember, on account of fighting the Thing. So as he leaps back, he passes by the Avengers mansion where Beast spots him. Beast had just turned back into his blue form in X Factor 33. I believed it was by being caused by a kiss from a girl that was previously kissing Iceman until Beast took the kiss for him and then had to be treated by their sentient ship. Did I mention the sentient ship? So at the end of Incredible Hulk 350, Joe Fixit is spotted by Beast and realizes the Hulk is still alive. He says there's an emergency and they really need his help, and that as a quid pro quo, if the Hulk will help them, the Avengers will pretend that they never saw him, so he can go on pretending to be dead and living the dream life in Las Vegas. And with that, we can finally get to our last issue of Evolutionary War, Avengers Annual number 17. The summoning happened thanks to a warning from Jocasta, who originally appeared during the Korvac saga and stayed as part of the Avengers until she finally left in issue 211. She would finally have her existence wrapped up with her death in the pages of, I shouldn't even have to tell you by now, Marvel 2-in-1, 91 to 92. You know, I'm starting to think Ben Grimm is Marvel's answer to Forrest Gump. She has been rebuilt now by the forces of the High Evolutionary and sent the warning that assembles the reservists who come to her location on Long Island. The Hulk gets dropped on them, and like the Hulk is wont to do, smashes up the place. But as the more intelligent version, he keeps around the one who demonstrated enough brains to say that he might have useful information. He directs them to the Pacific, where there's a conflict brewing between the Atlanteans and the Lemurians. The High Evolutionary's doing, of course, but it's not to cause them to fight each other, but rather to get them both in range of a device that's intent on sterilizing them. This leads to the High Evolutionary's undersea ship, seen in Spectacular Spider-Man Annual, although Spidey had teleported to it and away from it, so he had no idea. Well, the High Evolutionary is here to use the Krakatoa volcano to spread the results of his genetics bomb all over the world, mutating every single human being on Earth. Hence the reason for the slaughtering. It's to remove the genetically unworthy. And this is something the followers have seriously bought into. In fact, to reinforce it, the High Evolutionary has created a religion around himself, with supposedly masked priests leading them. Except the Avengers reservists know that the High Evolutionary wouldn't use masked priests, he'd use actual evolved animals because, well, that's his thing. And Cap, knowing a thing or two about the mindset of people who will purge the genetically unworthy, says all they need to do is make the human followers aware of that, and there's going to be civil war. To dupe them, Beast pretends to be a priest and makes sure that he is overheard talking about how great it is to be an evolved animal priest and not one of these losers around here. Because when this is all done, it's going to be the new men who run the earth and not humanity. So chaos breaks out when the truth that the priests are animal men gets out, but the High Evolutionary stops them from taking the bomb itself. What's worse, the captain notes that just destroying the bomb isn't going to actually solve anything. The High Evolutionary could just go and make another one. The only option then is to take him on his own level by evolving one of their own up to that level using the equipment here. Hercules is the most logical option, as he has the experience. But the Hulk thinks that it should be him given the powers of a god on the grounds of I deserve it. Instead, the High Evolutionary blasts him clear back to Las Vegas. The others hold off as Beast works to evolve Hercules. Even Yellowjacket blasts his inner ear to keep him from being able to concentrate until the new improved Herc can emerge and take him on. In the end, it works. Both of them evolve into an incorporeal state, and Jocasta plugs herself into the ship, defeats its coating, and sets it up to self-destruct and take the bomb with it, ending this threat to humanity. But this doesn't resolve the problem of there being no Avengers, does it? They're reservists. This is just a 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks every year kind of thing. The solution came up when the captain was dealing with the problems from the X-Men event Inferno, and thus reformed the Avengers with issue number 300, bringing back Thor, the even I didn't know it was in Marvel Comics character, Gilgamesh, and Mr. Fantastic and Invisible Woman. Those last two kept their old uniforms, actually, because it seems like the idea was to get them to realize that their place was with the FF. So after 5 issues of being Avengers, they left to return to that book. Remember what I said about the new regime and the illusion of change and the disdain for Avengers and Fantastic Four specifically? Well, that was the intention, so Englehart was forced to undo everything he had done. His response to being forced to write stories that he didn't want was to, well, not to put too fine a point on it, fuck with them. First, to show he was not happy with what he was doing, he wrote these under the pseudonym of Jonathan Harkness. Then, while dealing with the Human Torch's problems with his flame, Reed accidentally cured Ben Grimm, turning him fully human. With that done, that Watcher, Aaron, is back, takes the 5 members of the Fantastic Four and puts them in stasis while replacing them with 5 duplicates. These duplicates were made to be exactly what the new regime wanted, everything the way it was for all time. Englehart then had the duplicates intentionally redoing the events of the earliest issues of the book, even though they were completely out of place in the modern era. To really lean into it, Englehart also lifted entire lines of dialogue, word for word, from those issues. The response from the new Marvel leadership to see this ridiculous team was, they loved it. They wanted to give the parody of the Fantastic Four their own miniseries, unaware that it was a parody, clueless that Englehart was mocking the idea the stories must always be the same forever. The stories he had intended to tell were all playing out in the dreams of the real FF in stasis, so he got to tell his tales and make fun of this crap at the same time. The final issue saw the escaped FF fight these duplicates while the Frightful Four looked on the duplicates with loathing. Not for what they were. That was the team that the world fell in love with, after all. But rather it was the fact that they were unwilling to evolve. The line of the duplicate Human Torch is particularly resonant today, as the real one says, Reed had it right, we all have to become adults. To which the other replies, not me, never me, I'm a kid forever. I can't read that and not think of the tragedy of Spider-Man when Marvel doubled down on that one more day and brand new day thing. You know, I read an article recently about the departure of Joe Quesada, lamenting that the one story casts a shadow over an otherwise successful period of leadership, which I think is a bit like saying that it's a shame all those victories George Custer had in the Civil War were overshadowed by that one little fight at Bighorn. Like the Avengers, Walt Simonson was then sent in to mop up the Fantastic Four, his tenure lasting 21 issues, during which the most famous thing that he did, as far as that book went, was to replace the entire FF with the new Fantastic Four for 3 issues. It was Spider-Man, Wolverine, Ghost Rider, and the Joe Fixit Hulk. An idea that would be revisited several times, even to the point of having team-ups of other characters who had similar abilities to them, such as Silk, X-23, Robbie Reyes, and Brawn for one, and Venom, X-23 again, Alejandra Jones, and Red Hulk for the other. But what happened to Hercules and the High Evolutionary after the Evolutionary War, you're no doubt wondering. I mean, he's got to come back, right? He's got to do that cool story bro meme. Well, like I said, High Evolutionary is tied to Thor from the beginning, and so it's in the pages of Thor that things now happen. things, as they tend to, get complicated, and the aspect of Thor's hammer that allowed him to become Donald Blake was taken away and given to an alien with the awesome name of Beta Ray Bill. S.H.I.E.L.D. sets him up with a new identity, a construction worker by the name of Sigurd Jarlsson, which was just Thor changing his clothes and, no kidding, putting on glasses. The architect on the building he was working on with Eric Masterson, and eventually piecing together a connection between Eric and Thor, Mongoose kidnapped Eric and brought him to Wundagore, intent on drawing the Thunder God there so they could get genetic samples from him for the great work. But Count Tagar, one of the new men, is far more interested in their master and has tracked Hercules and the High Evolutionary to the Black Galaxy, which requires Thor's help or else this effort will fail. They arrive to find the pair somehow woven into the fabric of the bioverse that is the Black Galaxy. And it's such a threat, Thor has to don his battle armor, revealing his secret identity to Eric in the process. They reach a place where a Celestial awaits, and various items that look like the armor Celestials wear. Turns out Hercules and the High Evolutionary are both inside of one of them, and after heroing, they get freed, and they're their regular old selves again. Thor gives the High Evolutionary a tongue lashing for presuming to control the destiny of all mankind, and warns him never to try that again. The High Evolutionary agrees, since he'd much rather study the Black Galaxy and work on a certain project. One he doesn't mention involves collecting the remnants of Thor shaving off his beard and nicking himself in the process. But even as Wundagore leaves Earth again, Mongoose attacks, and with Thor down, Eric takes up Mjolnir to protect him. Eric gets mortally wounded in the process, and while the Mongoose is driven off, Thor felt so horrible about that he appealed to Odin to save him, using his last opportunity to call out to Odin. Moved by this selflessness, Odin merged the two of them together to allow them to survive, making Eric his secret identity, you could say, the old strike the walking stick and turn into Thor thing, except this time Eric is another being. Hercules started acting weird. Something inside of him had been left in the Black Galaxy that gnawed with its absence, he said. Upon returning, they discovered what the High Evolutionary had been getting up to, creating his own race of gods using the information gleaned from Thor's DNA. He calls them the New Immortals, because as established, the new gods has already been taken. He also is wondering what happened to the Celestials, as he figured out that it was their bodies merged with the bioverse, while the consciousness were kept in those containers that the Celestials had, until Thor had opened them. But he'd like to know why, because, well, he likes to know stuff. When the Recorder observes this and plans to narc on him to the Rigelians, the High Evolutionary blasts him, and then has him rebuilt into something more than a Recorder. Now he's an analyzer. Thor is aghast that this has happened. He knew the Recorder for a long time, hates to see this happen to him. He's even more upset when he learns the High Evolutionary says that once this business is sorted out, he's evolving humanity to the next level, despite Thor having told him not to. But the Celestial here is a bit of a distraction that allows Count Tagor to go to that special pool that is being used to create the New Immortals and evolve himself farther. Through this, he realizes the answer. While outside, the Red Celestial is constructing a suit around this white sphere thing, using the pieces they had found when they rescued Hercules and the High Evolutionary to do that. The Celestials had sent a duplicate of Thor, sort of, to draw him here so that he could get that missing piece back, except it was all a ruse. He's put back in the can again. When Thor tries to free him, he's zapped so hard that Eric is knocked right out of him. What's happening is that the Black Galaxy, all that bioverse stuff, it's what's needed to birth a new Celestial. That's what's taking place. And the High Evolutionary is excited at the prospect of it. So much so, even knowing that he's here for the same reason that Hercules had been brought here, doesn't matter to him. All he cares about is being ready to transmit everything that happens to him to the analyzer, as such knowledge will be invaluable, even if he winds up being reduced down to his component atoms in the process, so long as the knowledge is gathered for mankind. He's dedicated, you gotta give him that. Well, turns out he's not the one chosen. It's Eric. Because for all his artificially induced evolution, apparently Eric is a superior specimen. That's bad. But what's worse is that when the birth does happen, the High Evolutionary has been hooked up to the analyzer, remember. The totality of all the sensor information that the analyzer gathers gets fed back through the instruments and straight into the High Evolutionary's brain. So he's in kind of bad shape after that, but at least Eric and Hercules are all right. They're left behind by the Celestials after the job is complete. And in the next issue, in the midst of a pretty harrowing-looking thing involving giants, Thor is losing, and Eric insists that he be re-merged to give Thor the strength that he needs to survive and finish the fight. But being reunited is going to have ramifications. While serving as Thanos' toady, Mephisto was also getting up to some other schemes. The devil is a real multitasker. One of them was in the pages of Cloak and Dagger, which also dragged in Spider-Man and Ghost Rider, and at one point led to Mephisto eating one of his own servants on Earth for no other reason than the evils. But he also was interested in gaining an Asgardian immortal soul, and conspired with Loki on that. Loki goaded Thor to the brink of killing him, but Thor wouldn't cross the line. So Loki murdered, or at the least appeared to murder, a bystander, horribly, purely out of spite. In fact, it would have been Eric's ex-wife and son if the bystander hadn't shoved them out of the way. Now Thor has had enough, and very deliberately takes Loki's life. At this, Odin orders Thor banished from this realm, and Heimdall carries it out, only for Thor to plead for mercy, but not for himself, for the innocent Eric Masterson who is bound to him. So Heimdall banishes Thor, whose soul is then apparently captured by Mephisto and kept in a sack in his lair, where Eric Masterson now finds himself bodily transformed into a bearded version of Thor, except he still has his own mind. Quite a draft slot he's got there. And that finishes up our tie-in issues. None of this is required for the Infinity Gauntlet saga, but now that you know, some things might make more sense. Then again, when Mephisto is petty enough to ruin Peter Parker's marriage just to annoy him, maybe that is asking too much.